Hello and welcome back to Japanese Literature and Culture before 1600. I am your host, your teacher, your guide, your sensei. So this week we're going to be talking about two things: the Shotoku Constitution or the 17 Article Constitution, as well as a little bit of early Buddhism in Japan, which is magical. It's always fun to talk about. But first up in this video, we're going to be focusing on that Constitution. So let me bring that up real quick. All right, share that. All right. So here, once again, we see our outline as per usual. So starting here with item 4, that is not something I wanted to do. Here we go. Let me highlight it this way. There we go. So the Shotoku Constitution, which is what it's typically called, and quote unquote Chinese administration. So I should explain a little bit what I mean by Chinese here. So Chinese history is extremely long, as I imagine many of you know. And, you know, when you're talking about quote unquote Chinese culture, it's heavily dependent upon which historical time period you're focusing on. So in this case, we're primarily talking about the Tang Dynasty. Tang aesthetics, Tang architecture, and Tang everything is extremely important for the early development or this sort of early literary development in Japanese culture, whereas previously it was kind of a hodgepodge of nativist practices, assimilation of various like peoples. Here we're really talking about like the primary thrust of Chinese influence, direct influence in Japan. And this represented, as I note in item A there, a major cultural shift in the archipelago. The first and foremost being that this is the first moment in history in which you actually see writing by Japanese people, by people who consider themselves Japanese in some sense. It's worth noting that the writing itself is actually in Chinese, because that was the lingua franca of the greater Chinese cultural sphere. You don't really see actual Japanese writing. It's kind of, there's this thing called the Inariyama sword, which I will talk about next week, but we're primarily writing in Chinese. And this is important because it follows a typical pattern that you see in East Asia, where the sort of the use of Chinese comes first, and then the development of the vernacular language, and particularly a way to write the vernacular language, develops from Chinese writing. And that's true in Japan, it's true in Korea, it's true, like I said, most East Asian countries where Chinese was, heavily influential. So we have the quote unquote official introduction of Buddhism in 552. The period that we're talking about here right now is called the Asuka period. I'm not really going to talk a lot about the Asuka period. I want to focus on Nara instead. But be aware that we're not actually in the Nara period yet. We're still in the Asuka period. And so what happened in 552? Well, here again, we see sort of the way in which Korea functions as a primary vector, or sort of like the Korean kingdoms, I should say, function as a primary vector for like cultural exchange between Japan and the greater Asian continent. So King Song of the Kingdom of Baekje sent a mission to Emperor Kinmei in 552 that included, a number of emissaries, but among them were quite a number of Buddhist monks, and also they were carrying with them a number of Buddhist texts and like iconography that they gifted to Kinmei, and that sort of got the ball rolling, so to speak. There had been Buddhist missionaries who had traveled to Japan earlier, and so there were some Japanese peoples who knew about its existence, but it wasn't really an official thing until 552. And this also set in motion what in item 2 there is referred to as the Nanto Rokushu. So that, as those of you who can read Chinese, which are pretty much all of you, or most of you, you'll see that basically just means sort of like the southern capital or the southern municipality, 6 religions or 6. It's usually referred to as the 6 schools of Nara Buddhism in English, but that's what it's called in Japanese. So the next major cultural shift that you see in the so-called Asuka period is a move towards a quote-unquote Chinese style government. Again, Chinese in scare quotes there for a couple of reasons. One, because like I said, the whole question of like which China are you talking about, but also the fact that what we'll see is that everything in Japan, even if it has like a very clear like Chinese or Korean or whatever influence, always gets kind of mixed up with native practices and native influences, and so it's never really purely recognizable as one thing or another. The other major important shift here culturally is towards more, and I use the term Confucian. This is a word that I think is overused. You know, East Asian cultures are often referred to as Confucian cultures. But more specifically, what that means is that society in Japan becomes far more patriarchal. One of the interesting things, I mean, I noted this last week, is that early Japanese history, while predominantly patriarchal, also had a lot of avenues of like political and social engagement for women that actually ceased to exist in this period. So strangely, like earlier Japanese history was more egalitarian. You also in this period have the beginning of creation of so-called moral codes, which is that, it's not just, you're not just talking about codes that sort of govern like what you can do legally, or like legal prescriptions. You're also talking about sort of like prescriptions for what the proper way of life is. Also, society was in Japan was pretty hierarchical, and we talked about sort of last time the way in which like the accumulation of wealth had created, more and less powerful families and how all of that worked. But it's more like sort of rigidly hierarchical, sorry. And also in this period, there was a complete abolition of sort of the older like noble title system, the so-called kabane titles, and therefore the old like hereditary nobility completely dissolved away. What's interesting about Japanese society from here on out is the way in which you can sort of, there is a kind of social mobility. It's limited, it's extremely limited, but it does exist. Also, finally, the last major cultural shift is we start to see really clear and definitive signs of Chinese, which is to say Tang, influence in art, architecture, literature, history writing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So along these lines, one of the things I wanted to show, I hope it's this tab. No, it's not that tab. It's this tab. Okay. So this is the main hall of Todaiji, which is a Buddhist temple in Nara, which basically looks exactly like a Chinese temple of that period. There's hardly any distinction whatsoever. You could probably put this building in the middle of China. The sort of, we'll start to see more like native architectural styles kind of creeping back in, but at this period they're so into, like, it's interesting because when you think about Japanese Sino-Japanese relations throughout the years and how currently they're not very good, and how China and Japan have often not gotten along. This is a period in Japanese history where they were like, China, yeah, China rocks, China rules. Kind of like the way in which, all of a sudden, like, Western white Americans and Europeans all of a sudden like got really interested in Japan, whereas previously they had been extraordinarily racist towards the Japanese. A similar thing is happening here, although I guess in the other direction. So along those lines, and thinking about the way in which sort of Japan is moving closer towards China culturally, if not politically, as I noted last week, Japan was never a very good vassal. It was never a really great tributary state. They always kind of bucked at the idea of being subservient to the Chinese. But the Shotoku Constitution, which its technical title in Japanese is the 17 article Constitution. You can see that right there. But in English, and even oftentimes in Japanese, it's referred to as the Shotoku Constitution. And so we have that text here, and I'll be actually, I want to go down a little bit. So it starts here. I'm referring to that in a little bit, but before we get into looking at sort of specific passages, there are a couple sort of general things that I want to note. It's less a constitution in the modern sense. It's not really a document that lays out the structure of government so much as it is sort of like a statement of general moral principles and values. It's more like sort of, this is the way society should be. This is what the purpose of society should be. And so in that sense, it's a lot like the preamble to a lot of constitutions, but it doesn't really get into the nitty gritty of, you should have these offices, you should do these things. Yeah, there are a lot of later Japanese edicts that do stipulate those things. But at this point, this document is designed to be like, this is how we should be ordering society, and this is what society is supposed to do. Also, it's worth noting that it is primarily a work of cultural syncretism. Syncretism is usually used to refer to sort of religious practices that get blended together. But when we refer to cultural syncretism, what we mean is a way in which like different cultural practices and ways of thinking about how society should be organized are kind of intermingling and fusing with one another. And this document actually represents that very well. One of its primary fusings, if you will, is between sort of the Confucian. It's interesting because the writings of our good friend Master Gong do have a set of like personal moral prescriptions, but what this document is attempting to do is taking sort of the aspects of like Confucian philosophy that are more directed towards like how society is supposed to be structured, with these sort of personal spiritual principles that are embodied in Buddhist teaching. And so Confucianism in this document is understood more as a social discipline, which is to say how society should order and discipline itself. And then Buddhism is a personal discipline. This is not perfect. And like I said, it's what this document represents. We will see later when I talk about Nara Buddhism that Buddhism in Japan often was social and has social purpose. But in this document, we're taking the personal aspects of Buddhism, putting them together with the social aspects of Confucianism, sprinkle in a little bit of Japanese assimilative like philosophy, and then you get this thing. And there's a really strong emphasis in the document on harmony, and sort of the word here, when you look at the Japanese, actually, let's see if I can find the Japanese text real quick. So yeah, you can see I've searched for it a couple of times. Let's see, 17 article Constitution. Let's see if we can find this in Japanese. Yeah, so you see right there in the very first article. So, and also for those of you who notice, like, hey, look, it's in Chinese, because guess what? It's in Chinese. So, first item, second item, third item, so the first saying, second saying, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, right there. So harmony, or wa, as it's pronounced in Japanese, is fundamental. It's like it's right there from the get-go. And you see this in the text of the first article. When those above are harmonious, actually, let's take a look at the specific item itself. Take harmony to be of the highest value, and take cooperation to be what is most honored. All persons are partisan, and few indeed are sufficiently broad-minded. It is for this reason that some offend against lord and father, and some transgress wantonly against neighboring villagers. But when those above are harmonious, and those below live congenially with each other, and when mutual accord prevails in resolving the affairs of the day, then all matters, without exception, will be properly and effectively dispatched. So let's actually talk a little bit about something that gets mentioned here, which is sort of like those above are harmonious and those below live congenially with one each other. So there's this heaven and earth duality. And you see this again in Article 3, where, yeah, it says in the second sentence, the Lord is the sky and the ministers are the earth. There's this idea of sort of like, I mean, the word tenno literally contains the word for heaven in it. He's the heavenly dude. He's the heavenly superhuman. And so you have the emperor as the emperor and his family, the imperial family as the heavens, the ministers and the various other members of the aristocracy as the earth. And so long as the imperial family is in harmony with the earth, and there's this relation. And it's also worth noting that this idea of harmony doesn't imply that everything is the same. So actually, so I want to keep that in mind. Harmony, but not everything is the same. So the Shotoku Constitution really has three major goals. The first one is to allay differences between people so as to understand that truth and knowledge can come from anywhere. So this idea of like harmonious living, like everyone is in the same game. But again, not in an egalitarian manner. And sort of this heaven and earth juxtaposed duality is a really key to understanding this. Like you have the imperial family, clearly above, clearly better, and you have the ministers, you have the members of the aristocracy. They are the earth, they are the ground upon which everything is based. And there's an interrelationship between the two, a harmonious one, a cycle, a constant, I guess you could say, natural cycle. But the heavens are clearly better. So like it's not that everyone is on the same level, it's that you have different levels, and all of those levels are interacting with each other harmoniously in the way that you have, if you say have notes in a chord, they create harmony, but they're not all the same note. Another good example of this is in Article 7. I have a little quote here. Persons should each have their charge and should manage what is appropriate to their office without interfering in the business of others. And this goes back to what I was saying about this being an extremely hierarchical society. The idea is that harmony is achieved by sort of everything being in its place and having a place for everything. Now, what's interesting about that is that that kind of sounds good on paper, maybe. I mean, it is very fundamentally like anti-egalitarian and anti-democratic in our sense. But it means that there's this idea that like each person has a particular role that they're supposed to fulfill. In order to be the best version of themselves, they have to realize what that is and stick to it and never do anything else, essentially. Like you have to find your specific place in society and stick to it. If you don't stick to it, or if you don't find your place in society, that is what causes disharmony or discord. The other major goal of the Shotoku Constitution was to impress upon people that impassioned motivations and motives lead you astray. And so this is very similar to sort of the Western notion of Stoicism, this idea that sort of like really raucous emotions can cause you to behave in ways that are counterproductive both for yourself and for larger society. And so the Constitution says in Article 5, put an end to inducements and overcome partiality. Actually, I want to look at that in a little bit more detail. So Article 5, put an end to inducements and overcome partiality. Be fair-minded in hearing and adjudicating lawsuits. The indictments brought by the people are endless. And if they are so numerous on any given day, how many of them will pile up when measured in years? When those who preside over lawsuits take the garnering of personal profit, as their one constant, those who hear litigation do so with a view to receiving bribes, the cases brought by the property will be stones thrown into water, while those brought by the indigent will be like water thrown against the stone. And so you see this like sense of things are not harmonizing with each other. You have stone and water, which are completely different things. So again, we have a duality, but unlike the heaven and earth duality, there's not this sort of natural relationship. There's this discordant relationship between them. And what causes this to happen? Well, people acting for their own personal profit, for their own personal benefit. And then sort of this bit in Article 10, this is just another example. I'm not going to get too much into this, but Article 10 begins, contain the fury, rein in the irate glare, do not respond with anger at personal differences. People all have their own mind and all hold their own opinions. And again, this actually sort of merges these two ideas, both the idea that sort of you need to restrain your passions, but then also like understanding that everybody has their place and everybody good ideas can come from anywhere. People all have their own mind and all hold their own opinions, as the text says. So the third major goal is to show that we think and work most effectively when doing so in a cooperative manner. So again, you don't act for your own benefit. Everything works much better for everyone if you restrain your emotions and you understand that you have to work in a cooperative manner. So if we look at Article 9, it says trust is the root of what is fair and just. There must be trust in everything. It is the difference between good and bad, between success and failure. If the various ministers trust each other, what cannot be accomplished? And if they fail to do so, all will end in ruin. So there's the sense that like you don't act solely for yourself. You don't take everything upon yourself. You have to trust that others can do as well. And only through that can really great things be accomplished. Another example of this is in Article 17, where our friend Prince Shotoku says, important matters of state should not be decided unilaterally. So this idea that even the emperor is subject to this principle of like a sort of broad-based decision making. They must be discussed as needed with others. Small affairs are less important and do not require such consultation. So, when it comes to questions of like, what you're supposed to eat that night, you don't need to ask everybody like, hey, should I have salmon or should I have the chicken? But when it comes to important matters of state, when it comes to sort of the big things, you can only make those sorts of decisions by like involving as many people as possible. It is only in coming to discuss weighty matters where there is a worry something might go amiss that such affairs should become a matter of shared deliberation, thereby guaranteeing the right outcome. So there's this notion that the correct answer comes from consensus. Now, that may not necessarily be right or wrong, and you can think of all sorts of examples where sort of consensus opinions are just factually incorrect. But we're talking about sort of a political philosophy here. We're talking about a way of thinking about society, and from this perspective, the opinions that come from consensus and shared thinking are more valid, more just, more right than those that come from any individual's personal whim. In relation to this, I want to talk a little bit about something that sort of immediately. So the Shotoku Constitution was written, as I said, by our friend Prince Shotoku. I have a picture of him somewhere. Where is he? He's right here. So this is our friend. Was written in 604. So we're still talking about the Asuka period. And as we move from the Asuka period into what is usually referred to as the Nara Jidai or the Nara period. One major event are the so-called Taika reforms, the Taika no Kaishin, which is right there. So Taika, even though the phrase literally means big change, the reforms of the making new stuff, of big change. Taika is actually the name of the historical period, the Taika Jidai. So that's why it's actually called. But okay, this is kind of circular logic. The period is called Taika, but the period is called Taika because it was a period of great change. So make of that what you will. In this period, so how did this all happen? So why did we begin at 645? So prior to 645, there was this incredibly powerful family, the Soga clan, that don't exist anymore, and they don't exist after this period. Why is that? Because they were killed off primarily. The Soga were the very first clan, at least known, to have used the imperial family as puppets for their own authority. In other words, the official authority was still the emperor or empress, but the people who actually controlled things, politically speaking, were this family, the Soga clan. As you can imagine, and this is a cycle that gets repeated a lot in Japanese history, and we'll see the Fujiwara take over this mantle very shortly. But yeah, the shogun operated very similarly. The idea that sort of, the emperor is technically in charge and the shogun sort of rules on the emperor's behalf. The Fujiwara family were known for manipulating the imperial line. Like this will happen a lot, again and again and again. The Soga clan met their downfall as a result of what is nowadays referred to as the Ishii incident, which occurred in 645 CE of the Common Era. And this was a conspiracy between an imperial prince, Nakano Oe, and an aristocrat, Nakatomi no Kamatari. There's a really funny, if you can ever find it, there's a funny sketch, Nakatomi no Kamatari, from this Japanese comedy duo called the Ramens. Anyway, if you find it, it's funny. These two, along with some others, conspired to overthrow the Soga dictatorship, and this was achieved, but through I guess they got the ball rolling, so to speak, through the assassination of the head of the Soga clan, Soga no Iruka. Iruka, which you guys know from Naruto Iruka Sensei. So it's not that Iruka. I don't know. I like this very gruesome picture. This is an illustration from the Edo period, so this is much later. Here we see Soga no Iruka, and we see his bleeding stump and his head. It's just a wonderful illustration. I love it so much because it is so grotesque. So with the assassination of Soga no Iruka, and then later the sort of public shaming of his son or anyway, the dude who succeeded him, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. The Soga clan basically ceased to exist. The intent underlying this particular conspiracy was to supposedly reassert imperial authority. And this is another cycle that actually gets repeated a number of times in Japanese history, where people associated with the imperial family chafe at the notion that someone else is actually in charge and try to actually restore the emperor to real substantive power. It's interesting is that in later periods, particularly from the Nara period onward, and definitely throughout the Heian period, which we'll talk about in our next unit, it led to this really weird system where political power often resided either with some like patriarch of the Fujiwara clan. Now, it's interesting to note that the Fujiwara clan was founded by this guy, Nakatomi no Kamatari, who later became Fujiwara no Kamatari after the founding of this family. Or sometimes real power lay with a retired emperor. So, you would have an emperor who has to perform like official religious duties and whatnot, who would then officially retire and someone else would ascend the throne. But the retired emperor in his like cloister would still actually control the reins of power. And then the last thing I want to note in this video for today, before in the next video I talk about Nara Buddhism, is what is in Japanese referred to as Ritsuryo, right here. I'll get into this probably. I'll talk about this not necessarily at length, but in passing more typically when talking about the Heian period. This was the Japanese attempt to replicate the extremely complex legal and administrative system that was characteristic of the Tang Dynasty. It established all sorts of things. It established like administrative divisions within the country. So this is the first time you see like clear distinctions between provinces, districts, neighborhoods, clear like units of administration that weren't just like, clans ruling over particular areas. You see the establishment of court ranks, which is an elaborate and complicated system that, frankly, I don't want to get into, and also the establishment of a clear criminal code. And a court structure and sort of legal proceedings to arbitrate cases, rather than sort of like incidents being judged by like, clan heads or having sort of more arbitrary justice of the earlier periods in Japanese history. So that is so that altogether is kind of what you need to get out of the Taika reforms. Mostly I want you guys to focus on the sort of these cycles that will repeat, because we'll see it a lot in the literature, this sort of like relationship between the imperial family and then these powerful clans that try to control them, take them over, manipulate them, etc. That's something that we'll come across again and again and again. So for now, that's it for this video. We'll see you again shortly after I drink some tea and restore my voice, and we will talk about Buddhism. All right.